So I'm just going to make a quick start, which I want to ask each one of you in turn. Am I starting with you, Phil? I just want to know if you've got any particular comments to make or anything that you found particularly striking about Joe's data.
I guess sort of more questions than answers, to be honest. I think there's the birth weight sort of correlation with OCD seems to be pretty real and stark correlation. I'm not sure that going forward how we act on it and what we can do sort of management change-wise to try and prevent problems becoming surgical or or potentially worse.
Okay, thank you. Rob, you're up.
The one thing, Joe, that surprised me was probably your very first slide, where you put the percentage of horses going to the sales, the median and the average price. And that was something that I would never equate as being similar in the UK and the States, in that over here I always perceive us as an owner-breeder country with a smaller proportion of horses going to the stalls, whereas when I go to Keeneland, anecdotally, the vast majority of horses seem to go through a sale over there. So the percentage, I think it was 80%, was it, that you had down there as being sold. That was surprising to me.
Well, it was 80% of the ones that were offered for sale were sold. It was 70% of the total of each of them were offered for sale. So there was 30% from both. But it's a good point. I mean, this is really cool data, but it's on a pretty selected population of farms. And typically the farms that subscribe to the weighing program in Kentucky and the ones that provided a lot of the data here are better farms. Yeah. So I think it's probably skewed a little bit than if we went out and did every farm under the sun.
Percentages would be different.
Right. So, just the data about how they outperformed the sales that they were even in, and a lot of those were in, book one kind of sales, I think speaks that we had a fairly elite population. My prediction would be, though, that if you went to more of the owner-breeder deal, the incidence of problems would probably go down rather than up. And we've seen that in some farms that we participate with that are more commercial, tend to have lower body sizes all the time and have for years and years and years and produce really nice horses. I think the really good ones are breeding really good stallions to really good mares, and both of which are getting bigger and bigger, is my impression through time.
Jess, you're up.
Along with Phil's observation, obviously for the UK it was the April-born foals as well that tended to have the higher incidence of OCDs, higher birth weights, and if there's something we could do to try and control that birth weight, I think would be the aim, if this is what's coming out of all this data. And along with that birth weight, one of those other slides that was very interesting and which tied in with the first talk was when are these conditions actually happening? And it appears to be within those first 30 days. We are only picking them up later on down the line, so 9, 10 months down the line, or when there's a clinical concern, or when we do our survey rads, the damage is done. Now, in that period from birth weight to when we're doing our survey rads, if we alter anything in that time to alter average daily gain or exercise or anything like that, we know we can make them worse. Can we make them better is the question. And if by what we've seen today, the damage is done in those first 30 days, then the answer is no, in a way which is frightening. We need to then focus on when is it first occurring and how do we change that.
Okay, thank you. Pat.
First off, congratulations to you, Polly, and Joe, for, I think we should all applaud these guys for embarking on bit cringy, but yeah,
tiny bit, yes, thanks.
Embarking on this data collection, because it's quite refreshing to hear from the feed merchant that we should be feeding less, not more. And also it's easy for people, I think, in your position to sit back and enjoy the profits, but here you are investing in science and data, and it's all our responsibilities to help with that. You know, it's on us to help you collate that data, as painstaking as it might be, going through x-rays and whatnot. So thank you for that. Going forward, I mean, I would personally love to see a bit more data collection on feet. It's great to see the farriers here today, and what we dealing with on the coalface and stud farms is often starts at the foot, whether it's a pedal bone fracture or, you know, we're addressing that foot from day dot really to try and help things further up the limb. You know, contracted coffin joints, club feet, boxy feet, that type of thing, and I wonder if it'd be good to include that in our collection.
Sure, absolutely. And again, we were very happy that so many farriers are here today. Thank you for all attending, because we're all trying to work on this together, and it's important that we behave as a support network for you. Okay.
And just quickly, I'm quite relieved that there isn't a veterinary surgeon on the board here today, because in my opinion, my humble opinion, part of the problem that we're dealing with this whole sphere of growth and OCD is what are we operating and what should we be leaving? And that's the critical question. And I think, you know, there is a certain amount of pressure from surgeons to get in there and take that chip out, regardless of sometimes what the studies have shown. And that, I thought it was really cool, that slide that Joe showed about Hock Lesions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That obviously there's a difference in breed between us and the Americans, but there's clear evidence there that those that had Hock surgery had no difference in earnings or starts or even in sales money.
Yes.
So, you know, question is, should we be taking those out?
It does beg the question somewhat.
That's a can of worms anyway.
It is. Well, perhaps, but thank you. That's good commentary. Did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I think that these data are really neat. I'd also, again, like to thank Daniela, where she is, for putting all of this data in. I mean, it's a massive amount of information.
Yeah, she worked hard.
And my crew in the U.S., but if I'm going to look at the weakness of these studies right now, we need to gather management information. We need to know how these individual horses have been managed, how big the paddocks are, how long the foals are staying out, how much they're being fed. Because I think a lot of the answers that we don't have yet would come from that. If we could get those data and overlay it, I think it would start to make a lot more sense. We need to try harder to gather that, and I think hopefully the breeders will realize that there's a reason to give us those data, because a lot of times it's kind of a pain to gather up all that information. So that's something I think we need to have.
Sorry to interrupt you. There is a study actually being done at the moment by the Royal Veterinary College, Rebecca Mounsey and her team, and I think there's a good number of British studs involved. I know several
Rebecca joined us online yesterday. So.
Oh, did she?
She did.
Yeah. So they're measuring the exact size of the paddocks that they're going into, which has been a bit, you know, been a bit of a headache for the guys on the stud gathering that data, but they're 3 years in now, and they're following them through to racing. I think some good data will come out of that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, on that note, just a show of hands, how many of you are weighing your young horses? If you can just give me an idea. Okay. So how many of you then put a height stick up against them to see how tall they are? Okay. Yeah, that's one of the missing pieces of the puzzle, as Joe explained. And I know.
How many are condition scoring them?
Well, I think I tend to do that. I do that for them, but anyway. Because I guess this is where I'm going to not embarrass Phil, because we've already planned this. Phil, if you wouldn't mind standing up, please. Just want to point out, we laughed about this last night at dinner. Phil is 6'2", but if you looked at his body weight against his frame size, do you see the point? We need to understand how tall these horses are. You can sit down, Phil. Thank you so much.
I wonder if you could ask how many people are weighing mares.
That was just to make that point. I know it does take longer than if you're just tucking them on a scale. And fortunately, these young horses, they get very used to going on a scale, and it's not a problem. But if we can get height heights taken at the same time, it really makes the data a lot more meaningful, and we can then understand how tall they are. For example, if something is shorter and it's heavy, then we've just got a short fat foal, which nobody wants. They're not going to be athletic. Whereas if something's taller, we'll probably allow them to carry a little bit more body weight because they've got the frame to handle it, if that makes sense. So the other question is, does anyone ever weigh their broodmares? Ah, fantastic. Okay. Because this is the other thing that we'd really like, if we could have some better understanding of what the mare's weights look like during lactation. Because then we can match that up with the foal's average daily gain and make a bit more sense of it, particularly when we get into different birth months. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some other questions. Here's one. We have much more daylight in the UK in April and May. Does light have an effect on foal weight?
Yeah, day length has a big effect on foal body size, and I think that's playing a role in these April-May foals being bigger as day length is increasing, and it's also why you can't raise a very good southern hemisphere foal in the northern hemisphere, is because you're going with decreasing day length instead of increasing day length. And so I think for sure day length is playing a role in all of this.
Yeah.
But it is staggered in terms of the time of year that it's occurring regionally.
And on that note, in 2015, we did another series of seminars, which some of you may have joined us at, which was nutrition and the environment, where Joe specifically did comparisons between day length, all kinds of extra bits and pieces that you can find on our YouTube channel if you ever want to go back and have a look, because it's still very relevant.
And it seems that when we did all of that, we looked at temperature and day length and rainfall, and the pasture is related to soil temperature. The day length is probably more affecting the size of the foal.
Yeah.
But it's a combination of all of those that's leading to that.
Quite.
Just on that, Polly,
Yes,
people
please.
who use blue lights, so whether that's
Yes.
a hood or an LED in the stable, you'll find that birth weights are higher for the same reason.
Yeah.
Sure.
And also gestational length is tightened in those mares that tend to go over.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, good point. Thank you. Another question here. Which joint should we worry about the most as a concern at the sales? I'm looking at you, Rob. Would you like to start?
To pin it down to one joint, I think it depends for me
Of course.
what the lesion is. And I think the vast majority of joints, an OCD in the joint, you can cope with much more than a subchondral bone cyst. You know, if I had as Nick showed some examples, a small sagittal ridge OCD in the left fore fetlock, I'm not going to be particularly worried. But if I had a subchondral bone cyst in the bottom of the condyle and the left fore fetlock, that's a big deal. So I think for me it's more, and it's slightly contradictory of what Joe presented for the stifle, where the lateral trochlear ridge horses were having more of an effect than the ones with the medial femoral condyle cysts.
Okay.
But for me, the subchondral cystic lesions per se are much more problematic than OCDs, regardless of which joint they occur in. So I think to say, you know, a fetlock is more significant. Obviously, knees, fetlocks are high motion joints within the body. So,
Of course.
you know, you can cope with much more in a pastern than you can in one of those. But the type of lesion probably is more significant to me rather than the joint per se.
Okay. And location and size, presumably. Okay, that's fine. What is the optimum birth date and birth weight for the most successful horses? There's a big one. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think, you know, those data say February
Yeah, which is fascinating.
February and about 60.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
seems to be.
Have any of you got any thoughts on that? Jump in.
You're always going to get outliers, aren't you?
Of course.
Enable and C of class were both born in May, but Joe's data is pretty overwhelming, isn't it? February, yeah.
Well, of course, on Saturday we've got Tuesday. That sounds strange, but
Who
it's
was
true.
born in June.
Born on the 3rd of June.
But-
Yeah.
Won an Oaks on her third
And
birthday.
when that happened, I went back and looked at both of the data sets, and we didn't have a single June foal in the UK data set, and we had 3 in the Kentucky data set, and all 3 were unraced. So it
Right.
didn't,
So
it didn't really
outliers, of
follow
course.
right with
So-
Joe,
Interesting.
is the message here we shouldn't be breeding mares until March?
my hypothesis here was that it was going to be better to breed the horses later. I really thought that when, breeding them at a more natural time in April when they weren't being kept inside and whatnot. So these data really changed my mind on when it seemed to be the best. But I think probably all of this is a qualifier that April or May here may be the best months if you get your feeding and management in sync with the natural supply of forage. And I think that a lot of it is maybe if we were only breeding in April and May, we may have it a little closer to right. But since we've got these early ones too, and we tend to treat the late ones just like the early ones, we may be creating more problems. But I thought that it was going to be a later foal that would be better. So that's a surprising finding.
Please, Jess. Oh, Rob, go on, whoever.
I think, your question, but just to reverse it, would be more the take-home is we love putting risk to things. And if you have a mare foaling in April and she has the foal's got a birth weight of 64 kgs or higher, that now becomes high risk.
Right.
And what do we do about it? Do we start x-raying earlier? Do we maybe resort to ultrasound to start looking at those joints at a young age and then start to alter that foal to give it the best possibility that things don't go wrong or get worse?
And we were definitely feeling that we would need to effectively kind of tag
those
foals
high-risk foals
early so that we can mind them a bit more.
Yeah. And another one is the multiparis mare. So multiparis, 64 kgs, born in April. Red flag. Let's look after this one.
For sure.
High value, what can we do?
And on the farms that you're working on at the moment, have you seen a high proportion of bigger foals this year, do you think, or in the last 2 or 3 years? Any particular commentary on that?
Certainly get some years.
Yeah.
Like last year I thought was a bit of a bumper year for monsters.
Yeah.
But I guess they're the environmental conditions,
Exactly. And again, our weather patterns are a bit all over the place, and that was why we were also talking in Newmarket about whether we even need to have a slightly changing growth curve for what's happening with weather. As the climate changes, do we need to be looking differently because the grass is coming later? It's no surprise really that Joe is saying May is an issue, because at that point, for sure we have grass, but we seem to be slipping away from having as much grass in April as we perhaps did even 5 years ago.
I think those weights that we're seeing, though, for April and May must be due to the fact that as we're getting better grass through, people just aren't adjusting their total calorie intake for the mares, and that those horses being fed January, February and foaling in January, February and March are on the same calorie content but on a much less grass paddock diet.
Absolutely, that's it. And if you look at if you're in a temperate region like Kentucky is and England is, that has cool season grasses that really come on in the spring and really come on in the fall, you've got those two, really biphasic growth times. If you don't manage those, you're going to have these issues. If I look at other places where we deal with horses, and Australia is one, where you don't have that kind of seasonality, South America you don't, Florida you don't seem to have to manage it as intensely as where you have such a change in terms of the contribution of forage from one month to the next. And I just don't think that we're switched on enough to say, yep, it's time to change. To react quickly enough to change the management. So I think these data just show, maybe everyone already knew that. This data just kind of now reinforces that we ought to try a little harder to do that.
And just one other thing on the stakes winners that you showed the data on, that obviously there was that core group in the middle that had the higher percentage of stakes winners, 1 or 2 outliers. But did you break down the stakes winners to see when they won their stakes race as a 2-year-old, or were some of those small foals going on at 6?
I didn't in that particular analysis. One of the problems with these data, even though that's a heck of a lot of foals, when you start putting them into smaller and smaller buckets, you lose statistical power. When you start asking those more individual questions. So I have not done that. There was a nice study paper that was in Racing Post or Owner Breeder.
John Boyce.
That looked at that question about the month of birth and whether they started as 2-year-olds and whatnot. And those data seem to support basically the findings that we found, that those later foals didn't seem to do as well as the ones in February.
I probably think, Joe, that's for the reason why your lateral trochlear ridge lesions as a group in your data were more scary than the femoral condyle cysts, because to us, the general feeling would be the opposite. And I think when you split those trochlear ridge lesions into size, so less than 20 mil, more than 20 mil, you'd find that the bigger ones were dragging down that group massively. So it'd be good in the future when you've got enough power to look at these individual diseases in smaller buckets.
Well, maybe I didn't make it clear, but let me make sure that I explain these data. So when I showed the effect of the location in the stifle for racing versus unracing, I was talking about severe lesions. I was talking about ones described as deep sclerosis or cyst. Yep. And that incidence of unraced was 37.5 versus 36 for lateral trochlear ridge surgery. When I was talking about body weight, I was talking about any finding in the medial femoral condyle that could have been a mild lucency. So it was, a lot more horses than sharpening it down to the ones that just had cysts. So yeah, and when we tried to focus on just the ones that had cysts, in the survey data, it was not a huge population of horses, compared certainly to that 80-something that was anything. So that was the difference. When you looked at the severity, they seemed to have the same effect on racing, but if you looked at size and broadened the net a little bit more, the radiographic lucencies didn't seem to show any pattern. So I may not have made that clear.
That was interesting, because maybe that leans more to this theory of blood supply.
Yeah.
So if there's a trochlear ridge process there that's being damaged by big foals with a damaged blood supply.
And that was one of the questions that I wanted to ask, thinking about that whole failure of blood supply that Joe had described. What comments can all of you make about how we should manage bigger foals in their first 30 days in terms of exercise and activity, anything practical that we can try and help ourselves with? Phil, you're looking like you're ready.
Well, I guess the flip side of that question is that a small foal, and particularly a sort of a maiden foal, is going to be managed very differently to a bigger foal.
Absolutely.
So a maiden foal in January is not going to get anywhere near the exercise, the turnout, that a bigger multi-paris foal in April, May. So whether that is a factor into whether it's a concussion trauma that affects the blood supply, I think there's got to be some sort of correlation between the actual management of these two very different groups of foal.
Exactly. And Nick, you spoke a little bit yesterday about the way that we try and manage the nursery paddocks and just having those all-weathers a bit more and so on to be able to get them out.
I think that is crucial now with anyone who has any number of mares. They must have enough small exercise areas so that the animals can be exercised on good ground and with good pasture and some cushion. And one of the reasons we may be getting more trouble in May foals too is that our smaller paddocks have been pretty trashed by then.
They've been worked hard, haven't they?
And they're quite hard, and the foals then get turned out on heavily used areas. So I think people would be well advised to try and save some areas or water some areas, or possibly even have some all-weather areas to cope with that.
Just so they've got sensible footing.
And the exercise of foals, of course, it's not just weight, is it? I mean, it's so often we're exercising them for different reasons because they have conformational issues that completely change how we would manage them ideally for weight gain or control of weight gain. I mean, you can't turn a foal with slack hind legs out into a big paddock until it doesn't have slack hind legs any longer. We have to bear those things in mind. The windswept foals that correct themselves. You can't give them as much exercise as a foal that lands properly.
Absolutely.
And so I think all of those factors, we all have to make decisions on every foal when it appears to manage them correctly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Nick, also on that, I think it would be interesting to try and get more data on, is there a correlation between OCD development, birth weight, as well as other developmental diseases? So if a foal is born that is a simple fix, slack tendons behind, a couple of days of management and you've got a good foal, but is that foal now more likely to develop an OCD or not? And if we can answer that question, then we can get after them quicker or more visibly. It's easier to notice that and take note of that. So from a stud management point of view, then it's another flag of, I need to pay attention here and let's hopefully get some intervention.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm just...
Let me, I would highly recommend that any of you, and particularly the veterinarians here, go and read those review papers from the Norwegians about the pathogenesis, because it's fascinating, but also read the data about pigs, because they've got this down to a science about what is actually causing these things. And they said when they were looking at the genetics and whatnot, that pigs with longer backs and bigger hams ended up with a higher incidence of stifle surgery, or not surgery, stifle OCDs. They don't operate them, they eat them. But
Good point.
It's the chondronecrosis theory, right? So that it's being squashed.
Yeah, that it's
Literally
a big, long biomechanical force thing.
Yeah.
And they did, we probably couldn't do this in foals, but they did a study where they took piglets and they dropped them from different heights and then looked at the incidence of the problem. But they made sure that it was all less than a meter that they dropped them from. And they found, unsurprisingly, that when they dropped them from that height, they developed OCD early on. So there was some trauma that was occurring there. But through selective breeding, they reduced the incidence of stifle OCDs from like 6% to 2%. So, I mean, they were able to find the genes and selectively breed against it. Obviously, we're not doing that. We're probably selecting in the opposite direction for that phenotype.
Well,
that is...
The fact that these genes have been carried through in the modern thoroughbred population tells us that probably, on balance, they don't affect performance that much.
Yeah.
True.
But we won't be dropping them from a metre or even above, obviously. Okay.
But just to go back to that point, I get that theory is very credible, and it's basically saying we need to put less mechanics through these bigger foals. We need to wrap them in cotton wool. The flip side of that is locking up a foal. Want to hear other people's opinions on this, is notorious for encouraging OCD.
Yeah.
Ian Wright's words always ring in my ears: a foal that's been locked up for 70 consecutive days in its first year of life will not make the track, won't race. So, where do you find that line?
And that goes further back to Leo Jeffcott at the Animal Health Trust in the 70s and 80s, saying exercise is chondroprotective, and that hasn't changed. They have to be exercised in order to have healthy joints and bones, and wrapping them up to the extent that they don't do that is the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
So
well, wrapping them up that turns into locking them up is...
Well, it's the worst thing that you can do.
Becoming heavier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They become heavier
Yeah.
top, so more pressure.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
also, we've also got the mare to look after. So,
Quite.
mares stuck in boxes don't generally get in foal. So,
No.
there's...
So it's a double problem
Yeah.
then that you've enforced on yourself,
Yeah.
which is best avoided.
So it's
Absolutely.
finding that sweet spot again of
Yeah.
they have to get exercise, they need a lot of it, but it can't be too much exercise in too short a burst that you have an overload. So it's getting that balance correct.
And I do remember some of the work that you did in the 2-year-olds, where it was almost as if, well, I suppose we would equate it to wearing a Fitbit that we're probably a bit more used to. It was the number of steps that they took in a day to get good bone density. It didn't need to be heavily concussive. It was just movement.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of studies on bone development where there's an optimal number of cycles that the horse needs, and it's a relatively small number. But the worst thing you can do is lock them in a box, particularly when they're growing fast. So trying to, again, find that. And as you said, you'd lock a mare up with a foal in a box, and then you turn them out and you give them a big paddock and she's off to the races, so that makes it even worse.
So Joe, would you, in those foals that are over 64 kilos at birth weight, what would you advocate weighing those for that first month then? Daily, weekly?
I don't know that that's going to tell us that much. I'm not, and it's good that you asked that, because I think we conflate body size and growth rate. And I don't know that we really, that they're really the same thing in the context of what I'm talking
Daily
about.
weight gain.
I think it's in, body size and height, putting some biomechanical stresses on joints combined with the conformation that makes that more of an issue is different than the bone is growing very quickly, and that in and of itself can be a totally different set of issues. But on the theory of disruption early of vasculature, I think it's a body size thing, not a growth rate thing. So I don't know that we would learn that much if you did it more often.
So again, coming back to the prevention is going to be better in that the mare's management in that last trimester is maybe even more significant than the first 30 days.
Yeah, I think that getting, even being aware of this, thinking about it, when are these mares going to foal and what are they eating now and what are they going to be eating when they foal? I just think a lot of farms don't think about that. It's just not really on the radar of wanting to change that there's not much of a plan, and I think that could be improved. But up until now, we didn't really think that it was all that important.
And
But I do have a question here saying how much influence has the in utero supply to the problems of late-born foals. So they are thinking about it in this room. We just need to help everybody through it. Don't we?
I think that's fascinating. I mean, in the last trimester of pregnancy, what should a mare be gaining in weight every week, month? Have we got figures for that?
Yeah, there are data for that. I can't give you that off the top of my head, but yeah, there are data.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff we were talking about feeding or weighing mares was lactating mares.
Yeah.
And that's because it's easy to do, because you've just weighed the foal and she's standing right there, so you follow her on. Yeah. Very few of our farms weigh pregnant mares. Yeah. It's a more logistically difficult to do, and that's probably an area we need to concentrate more on is how are they gaining at that point, and how is that related to the ultimate size of the foal.
It's quite a risky strategy as well. So when you start manipulating the late-term mares' dietary requirements, I think there's plenty of mares that are in very good body condition that year on year produce poor small foals and vice versa. So some mares do themselves and not the foal, and the other way around. So how you tweak the mare's nutrition to directly affect the foal.
The thing we did learn from that study, the one that I showed that had 3,900 mares in it, we didn't weigh them until they already had the foal, so it would have been in the first month. But if you took that weight of the mare and the body condition of the mare and the foal, fat mares produce fat foals. So there was a correlation between there's a lot of mares.
Big foals or fat foals?
Big fat foals.
Right, so tall fat foals.
But we were looking at body condition scoring too, so that's the fat part is thrown in from body weight and height, and they did grow faster, But as I said in my talk, when you have a lactating mare gaining weight during lactation, you've gotten something out of whack with how much you're feeding her to what she actually needs to go, because that's.
But on that, Joe, I mean, what is your mare foal? She's in good condition. Mm-hmm. If you don't up her feed, she's feeding the foal, she might lose some weight. Then the stud gets anxious that their cyclicity is going to be affected, and you get lactational anestrus and all the other things that complicate our lives of getting the mare back in foal again. So there's a contradiction or a difficulty between managing the mare for her fertility and the management of the foals. So what is the absolute ideal?
Right, I didn't show the slide from that study where we had body condition score of those lactating mares. Not only did their weight increase, but their body condition score did too. So, foal them at a 6 and keep them at a 6, or a 5.5 and keep them at that. Don't foal them at a 7 and have them go to a 5.
So does that mean you're maintaining their weight as near as possible to their weight after they've foaled?
Yeah. It is. I mean, it's kind of dangerous to take that weight right after they foal because that's not a really indicative of what the mare's weight will be. But a few days after she's stabilized, then yeah. But I think, and there weren't a lot of hands, and maybe it's Polly's fault because she's the one coming out condition scoring, but condition scoring them too, because there's 3 pieces to that puzzle. There's body weight, there's height, then there's fat. And so, you kind of need to have an idea of how fat they are.
Yeah.
And the problem with doing studies like this is people overreact to them. And, you'll end up with probably the vets coming back going, oh, they listened to the bloody pagan and now they're all 4.5s and I can't get any of them back in foal and that sort of thing. And it's like, no, keep it in the center, I think, is the...
Yeah. Or just concentrate on the May foalers, right? You're saying that we've got a big spike in the May foalers. They need to be treated as a separate population, perhaps.
Yes, given that that's when we would expect that we'll have plenty of grass for them to eat, and they will hoover it up at that point.
Yeah, and the data's telling us they're bigger foals with more surgical problems.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I concentrated on the big foal, but what's interesting is if you look at the first quartile foal, they're like bulletproof. The ones that are little, they don't have, the incidence is so much lower. So, I mean, it really seems to be protective to have a foal that's smaller. So that goes towards the whole biomechanical type of strain thing.
Okay, well, I'm going to start roving around in case any of you want to grab me for a question. But meanwhile, is the data significantly different for colts and fillies, Joe?
Which data?
When you put up the growth curves.
How
different are they?
Yeah, there's a big difference between colts and fillies, and I didn't show it here, but fillies tend to get fat earlier as yearlings. They will put on weight earlier and become harder to manage as yearlings, as probably everybody knows, because they have a tendency to get fat early. So it's different. When we were looking at all the incidents of disease and whatnot, we did not break it into gender, though. So I'm not sure how in that particular perspective, they were different.
I've got a few questions, I'm afraid. We weigh everything once a week on the yard, including every foal and every mare within 8 hours of birth. We do find on our yard, might not be with everyone, but when the bigger mares foal, we find they lose a lot more fluid in general, and they'll put that fluid back on within the first week. So we generally take their following week weight and we progress from there, basically. So I was just trying to touch on your mare dam side of things. But my main question is really, with all your data, with the OCD, our May foals, I mean, we've had some monsters this year. We do control exercise them on our yards. But surely the environmental factor is one of the biggest things. They're bigger foals on harder ground at that time of year on better grass, and they're bound to grow quicker because they're on better forage anyway. Is that really put into the factor of your statistics as well? It was just a question for me.
No, absolutely. I think you hit on it. It's the conversion of all of those different factors at the same time. And that's where we need to have better data. We have tried, even the hallway guys have tried taking out penetrometers, to look at the hardness in pastures and put the weather, lay that over it, and it becomes really, really hard to decipher. There's so many of those different factors that are contributing But I think they're all kind of going in the same direction. I think that is, and we're pointing at May foals, and that's a terrible thing, but there were only 7% of the total population were May foals. It seems like already and it was 10% in our Kentucky population, so it's a fairly small number of horses that we're talking about.
22% of those May foals suffered
from
OCD,
yeah,
which is massive.
Yeah.
Can I just ask really quickly on that point, is there a relationship between the age of the foals when they first hit that hard ground then? So when you've got your February foal, by the time they get ground gets particularly hard, they're 3 months old, 4 months old. So whereas you've got foals that are a few weeks old, a couple of weeks old, they're going out straight onto the hard ground. Is that
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the explanation for all of this is going to be the intersection of environment with size. And when you have a situation where there are two negative things intersecting at the same time, it's going to be magnified as worse than maybe there's one that's forgiving for the other. So I think all of those things are playing an effect in the whole month of birth scenario.
And I think there's no doubt that our present lack of rain in March, April and May is bringing that problem forward. We have more foals suffering as a result of concussion on hard ground in the early spring months than we used to have when the ground was better, wasn't it? And the delay in the grass growing because of cold, dry springs makes it even worse as well. So I think your points were very well made, yes.
I think definitely the amount of fractured pedal bones, and maybe not so much sesamoids, but fractured pedal bones over the last 2 seasons has really rocketed.
Yeah.
So presumably if there's trauma higher up the leg as well.
My question is about lymph deformities, and wondering whether we should be more aggressive with lymph deformities, putting screws in them at a younger age to try and minimize the pressure points or the concussion points in the joint, to try and stop that cartilage from dying off in the first place, rather than trying to prolong with extensions for a long period of time, and not really winning with it, and what age would you then, or how aggressive would you be to try and correct that lymph deformity?
Very good point. Nick will probably talk more about this than I will. I think for the severe cases, you're quite right. I think a screw to prevent those eccentric forces from a big wedge extension. You've got to bear in mind the time scale. The earliest screw you're going to put in is a fetlock screw, and you're not going to put one of those in until at least 9-10 weeks. So what do you do in the interim? And I think most people would agree a Delric or an extension from 10 days old, when the foal's foot can accept that kind of heat, will stabilize the limb and allow you to get to that stage when you can get the screw in at the earliest possible time. But I think you're quite right. Mechanically, that makes sense. The more we understand about OCD and cysts, the more it's looking like it's trauma, concussion, chondronecrosis. It's all pointing in that direction.
Yeah, I just slightly take issue with Patrick on the timing. I think that we're coming forward.
Earlier.
Yeah, we would go for 2 months as the ideal time to put a screw in the lower cannon, and knee we would always leave till 12 months. And there's a number of reasons for that. If you go earlier than 2 months, the correction can be incredibly quick, and the timing of screw removal can be a bit of a nightmare. At 10 weeks, you're going to correct the minor ones, but you're not going to correct the more severely angled ones. So I would aim for 2 months if you're going to do it as a general rule. And if it's very severe, do it at 7 weeks. And if you are becoming keen on transphyseal screws, of course, it takes the pressure off the farrier from doing anything too dramatic to the lower limb with major extensions, and just keeping the feet in balance and allowing the foot to improve as much as it will naturally may be perhaps a better way to go than altering the strain on the limb so much when they're quite severely twisted. Some of the farriers might like to have a view on how they feel about that now, having gone through the last decade of doing it. Yeah.
I would say, Nick, most of the time you're putting your extensions on at 10 days. What within 6 weeks, you know, the vet knows whether it's going to need a screw or not. Once you get to 7 weeks, if you haven't got it straight by then, you're just holding it.
Yeah.
So that's the time to make that decision with your vet. But once they've had 2 sets of extensions on, it's either good or it's not, and you're just going to be pursuing it all the way up to the yearly sale, and you're still not going to get it right. So I would say, like Rob, I do a lot of work with Rob, we'd do 7 weeks, it'll be, yeah, now's the time to go. And by putting that screw in, you haven't got to keep warping the feet, you haven't got to keep distorting everything, and you can go back to a natural shaped foot.
I would be interested from the panel, you know, most of the OCD we were talking about were in joints in the hind limb, and these corrections, what percentage of those are happening in the front limbs, and what percent are you correcting in the hind?
Well, the vast majority would be forelimbs.
Yeah, and so, it seems like you're correcting those, but we're talking about OCD lesions in the stifle and the hock.
Only a few rare fetlock varus behind. You know, you get 1 or 2 foals that just can't position their foot correctly. They rock off the outside wall, and it creates that fetlock varus. And despite putting a cuff or extension on.
Do you think correcting an angular deformity in the front end would have any effect on the biomechanical pressures in the hind end?
Not overly for me.
That's free.
Yeah, no.
I'm sure it would, but it's so hard to measure, and it would be pretty small.
Yeah. I think the benefit of doing it in the forelimb is massive. Both, you know, and we've touched on it already. There's always 2 aspects to this. There's the commercial aspect of it, when it comes to that horse being presented by your client at the sales, and somebody is there to buy that horse, and there is that commercial pressure in the sense that the horse wants to be correct in order to attain its full potential. But then there's also doing an intervention from the individual's point of view. And I think the things we've done, you know, as Nick has said in his talk, the correctional surgery has come a long way from the x-rays that they showed where we were using staples, then a transfascial bridge, and now the transfascial screw. So cosmetically, it's become much more acceptable for our clients to want to do it. But there is a biomechanical, and you've touched on it there, reason to do it. Because if you have that horse with a fetlock varus that then goes to the sales and into training, or with a very offset knee and it's pushing the knee at the walk, there's much more pressure down the medial aspect of the knee. McElraith studies show that when we look at the radiocarpal bone, you know, the bone most frequently chipped is the distal aspect of the radiocarpal bone, the medial aspect of the knee. So that pressure component that they do get in training is important. So I think it's the right decision that we always weigh it up, should that individual have surgery or not in each case. But for the correction, particularly those varus and fetlock varus and knee varus, there is also a reason to do it from the horse's point of view when it comes to racing on the track and its future well-being.
I'd like to know what everyone's view in on how we should be handling this increased manipulation of conformation. Do you think we ought to be declaring this in all horses? Because we are improving the conformation of these horses dramatically now, and when we select them as broodmares or stallions, it's quite relevant whether they had screws as foals, I think. I'd be intrigued to know whether everyone would be horrified if they had to put it in the passport, or whether they think it would be a good idea. I mean, is it right that nobody has any idea that this has happened? It's a fascinating point, I think. I know we've always manipulated their limbs with the farrier and with other techniques, but this is rather more dramatic management, isn't it?
Can we just have a show of hands of who would be horrified, just out of curiosity? Okay. Well, right enough.
If you're trying to sell them, you're trying to produce the perfect animal for someone to buy them.
Sure.
And that's our job, to produce a perfect animal.
Yeah.
And you're consequently possibly making us lose our jobs. but that said, we're all breeding, so we don't want to breed bad genetics for the future of racing.
No, it's exactly the point I'm making. I mean, it's quite relevant information, isn't it? Mm.
If you knew that horse would have screw surgery, or even the mare, the wingling or the year before, it also has surgery, would it put you off?
Well, it would probably be a factor, but it wouldn't stop you buying it because it's a nice horse and it walks well and it lands well. As a racehorse, it's not going to affect it. I don't think it. I think there's very little to argue against doing this for the performance side of the horse. It's the valuation of the animal as the end product that I think is quite interesting. Because obviously the horse that's been reared that's never had to have any surgery of any sort is possibly more desirable than one that hasn't. That's the only point I'm making, really.
Nick, I would think that it all comes down to selection, and we are all selecting the fast horse. And with the intervention of putting in screws and doing all of this, we can keep doing that. So then the most important factor is how fast is the horse. And even if we start declaring these things, personally, I don't think it's going to change people's minds, because we can still put a screw in this foal. It would be interesting for us to have that information, but I don't think it will change the selection.
No, the best horses are probably always going to be the most sought after.
Well, we've got Ed Sackville here who buys a lot of horses. Ed, would it put you off if you had two horses that you really liked, one had a fetlock screw and the other had not?
Oh, sorry, I was just looking at the racing results.
Actually, he wasn't.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I think ultimately information is key. It always helps to know as much as possible. The more one knows, the better, and it'll give you an idea of your valuation. Perhaps one may have if there were two identical horses with two identical pedigrees, perhaps you would have a stronger valuation on the one which hasn't had any surgery. But assuming that the veterinary team were happy that the horse was very much a racing prospect, no, I don't think it would. I don't think it would bother me at all. I'm sure there are plenty of champions, and I know of plenty of good horses which Alistair and I have been involved in from a homebred point of view, who have had various have had surgery. I mean, I'm very happy to say that I don't mind disclosing it. I remember Sky Lantern. We took she had a small procedure done in between her, albeit in between her 2-year-old and 3-year-old year, but she did, and it certainly didn't affect her. So, no, I think it certainly helps to know, but I don't think it's something which would massively affect the outcome.
And what if you're buying for breeding?
That is the key thing. If you're buying for breeding, certainly I'd want to know about wind surgery, which is something which is now more public, and has to be announced. That would be a definite issue. From the point of view of you're buying a mare who on the face of it appears to be incredibly correct, and then she consistently produces offset foals, and you can't quite get your head around that, then yes, I think from that point of view it would certainly be a big help. But from the racing point of view, I would probably be that much more relaxed.
So with that in mind, I can't see the declaration happening.
The only problem with that is that obviously if it's not declared as a yearling, then it's not going to be declared as a mare, because the person who's bought the yearling doesn't know that anything's been done to it. So it has to be done as a foal or or a yearling, or not at all?
I think that's going to be, I mean, the foal sales and yearling sales finish late enough, and with all the announcements Tattersalls are now going to be making, I think it's now going to become a 7-day sale.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got a couple more questions around the room. I'm just heading back.
Do we know whether it's the constituents of the spring grass or just simply the amount of forage they have access to that's causing that increased growth?
So could you repeat that?
Is it the constituents within the spring grass, or is it just the amount of forage they have access to that's causing that growth?
No, that's a great question, because you can look at it two ways. Is it the total caloric intake, in which case you don't care what the calories are from, it's just they're eating more calories and therefore they're gaining weight. There is a reason to think that it might be the source of calories as well. That if even a pregnant mare is eating high levels of sugar and she has high levels of blood insulin over an extended period of time, that might have an effect on cartilage growth and maturation and whatnot. So that may need to be thrown into the mix with May grasses as well, that is their non-structural carbohydrate intake higher, causing more of hyperinsulinemia either in the mare or the foal. So I think that could be part of it. I mean, if they're eating more of the grass, even if the grass doesn't have a higher content of sugar per se, you're eating more of it, therefore you're consuming more non-structural carbohydrate. We did do a study a while back, 2000, where we looked at glycemic response of weanlings. These were 200-day old, and we saw a correlation between how much glucose and insulin they produced in response to the meals that they were feeding and the subsequent incidence of OCD. So there can be an endocrine effect kind of layered into all of this as well.
Hi, my question lends itself quite nicely after that one, which is, do you have the statistics between body score regardless of birth month in the sucklings and yearlings and the instances of OCDs? So would you find that fat January, February, March, April born foals had higher instances of OCDs?
Yeah, I didn't show because of time constraints, but I would say in February is a great time to have, but there still is OCD in February foals. It's just a smaller percentage. But when you look at the ones in February that have OCD, they're big foals. So, they would be 70.
But are they big foals or are they fat?
Are they heavy foals? One of my staff keeps telling me you shouldn't say big because big doesn't refer to body weight. They were heavier foals. I don't know. We have not looked at the body condition score to see if they were fatter foals, if that's your
I sometimes
question.
feel there's a bit of pressure in the trade, maybe from a client perspective, that the foals should look maybe not fat, but well covered all the time. And in doing so, are we increasing the instance of OCDs because we're pressured to have a foal that looks like a model?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're feeding your foals so that they look pleasing to people coming to look at them all the time, you're going to have a higher incidence of problems. I think that really is an issue. But I mean, it's a big issue with people boarding mares and foals because they want them to be, look like they're ready to go to the sale at all the time. And I think that does put undue pressure on them to have that's not the healthiest thing for them.
Joe, do you have data from 20 years ago with birth weights of foals and heights? And how do they compare to
the
today?
question is, do we have data from 20 years ago on birth weights and heights? I have not done. See, our weighing service in Kentucky, we don't do birth weights. So we've only would have the first 30-day weights. I have done that study recently in yearling weights, though. We looked at yearlings in 2002 versus 2015, and these are yearlings in Kentucky, and they averaged about 15 kilos heavier in 2015 than 2002. So I think the breed has changed over that time to a bigger.
I would definitely agree with that. I've been practicing for 40 years, and 25, 30 years ago, 80% of all the foals that you would see would have a toe-out conformation.
Mm-hmm.
If you see one now, you're lucky. Most of them have all got varus fetlocks and one a toe in. So in the old days, you were fighting to pull them in. In now, you're fighting to pull them out. So there's a massive change in breeding and conformation, and probably Nick would agree with that.
I agree. Towing in is the biggest issue that with rearing horses now, isn't it? I don't worry about towing out. I never have done, really. I think there's a lot of evidence that towing out is protective for racing. So I think that people panic unnecessarily with towing out. But towing in and the load that it puts through the knee is known to increase unsoundness and reduce number of races at 2 particularly, and at 3. So getting the front feet out by a degree or 2 is what we have to be aiming for. I don't think, except for the few extreme ones, I do anything in recommending now anything other than a level trim for towing out and rotation.
Just leave them alone, let nature take its course.
Absolutely. I'm completely with you, Gary, there. Would anyone else feel really worried about towing out and in young foals? I mean, it is, I think, protective.
It seems like the width of the chest is wider now, and a narrow-chested foal is going to toe out, and a wide-chested foal is probably going to toe in as it gets wider, and that seems to be the phenotype of and I'm talking again about the American dirt horses, more of that broad-chested kind of horse.
And I think it's
so
also...
Connor, you've had more experience with that. So,
No, I completely agree, and we discussed earlier that the American dirt thoroughbred is a different animal to what we're breeding over here. But I agree with the panel there in that when they're towing out, 90% of the horse we're breeding today, we're pumping these. We're trying to make these into damn near bodybuilders, especially if they're a sales horse. They're going to come round as that chest comes. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask a question in relation to the osteochondrosis, or I suppose going back to the potential root cause of it all. If it's a blood flow issue to the cartilage, and you touched on when we start locking these foals up. With yearlings, mares, when we lock these horses up, we get very proactive. So Phil touched on when we lock up these mares, we'll start treating these mares proactively for fluid. We'll put them on oxytocin, we'll go back to the blood supply issue, they can go on pentoxifylline or aspirin. Is there anything we can do proactively to promote a blood flow in a young horse? I understand that it happens at such an early age. You don't want to go shooting syringes of Trentol into a 4-day-old foal, but is there any way that we can supplement that to promote blood flow? If we're going to restrict the exercise and we're not going to get the blood flow through the bones.
Don't drop them.
Yeah, don't drop them, whatever you do. Now, that's a huge question. Is there anything angiogenic that you can give to keep the blood supply, or if the blood supply is damaged, to get it to reconstitute? That's a good question. Part of, going back to the copper thing, everyone looked at copper originally as important because it's part of an enzyme, lysyl oxidase, that affects collagen formation, but it also has an effect on the vasculature, the strength of blood vessels. So it may be that copper plays a role in some of that and keeping that intact and preventing some of these problems that occur. But if you're going to do that and it's early onset, look at feeding the mare, not the foal. Yeah. That's a late pregnant mare sort of strategy rather than the other. But I'd be interested if there is anything that, if you say we've got a disruption in vascular blood flow, what is there you could give that would potentially help that? I don't know.
without affecting the foal adversely at the same time.
If it is a crushing mechanism, you know, it's anecdotal, isn't it? Because no one's tried it, but you'd be, I think, stretching the imagination to think that a vasodilatory drug would be able to protect that process. You know, just thinking out loud, if it is a crushing problem.
It's more so being proactive, so before the trauma or the crushing starts. So Phil touched on it, if you get a pedal bone fracture and you're locking this foal up, I'm not thinking about the pedal bone, I say, I'm talking about our stifle OCDs. How can I make sure that the rest of my foal is being taken care of because I'm looking after this one particular injury? Is there anything proactively we can do there? Or is it that's just a demon we're dealing with?
Good question.
It's a good question. I don't think we know that. But I'd like to come back just on Joe's point about the copper, because, of course, when we started, it was before the copper supplementation and the balancers all came in. Copper supplementation and attention to microminerals and to calcium phosphorus balance in the total diet of the horses has made an unbelievable difference to all kinds of things, to the incidence of fasciitis most particularly. We just don't see as much as we used to unless they've got abnormal conformation. The Wobbler incidence is, I mean, it's really quite unusual to find a wobbler now. I mean, every year at the sales, a horse used to get off the ramp at Tattersall's, and they said it was normal when it left, and it could hardly stand up when it got off the box at Tattersall's. And they were the great big strong ones. And the other extraordinary thing is when I started, and this comes back to the vascular fragility with copper, I mean, I would be up most nights some nights, most weeks, dealing with a convulsive foal that had a cerebral bleed. And now, I mean, we see a few maladjusted foals that have had problems, difficult births, but those acute convulsive foals that we used to see and used to take us weeks, I mean, we see a few every year, but compared to how they used to occur, they're nothing. And I think we've got nutritional improvement to thank for that reduction. Yeah.
I think just coming back to Connor's point about be it the crushing injury or touching on pedal bone fractures, the key is probably the locking up aspect of it. And there's very few conditions in the foals that I treat that I would consider I would have to lock the foal up in a stable, for example. In that locking up for me would be turnout in that indoor school or managing a small outdoor wood chip paddock or something like that. And that includes the pedal bone fractures. You know, I don't have any worse results. The hoof wall is such a good capsule and cast in itself. I don't have any worse results with those horses that then go to the sales or go to the track, having locked up in a stable as I used to do 5-10 years ago, compared to those ones that I have wandering around. And I think that level of exercise where it's not out galloping around the paddock for the crushing injury, it's still getting some activity, still some bone stimulus, but equally whatever its injury is being. And it's also important to touch on that when it comes to doing the transfascial screws, because that was in the past something that we were perhaps a little bit excessive with, was the post-surgical management. And those horses for us pretty much go back to normal exercise the next day. You know, they have a strap-on bandage for 5 to 7 days that stays in place, gets taken off, but they're in turnout, be it a wood chip or barn for those days, and then after that they're back out in normal paddock turnout until the screw's taken out. So I think it's important just to make that as well.
No, that's a very good point, thank you. We could talk for hours, couldn't we? But I think we're going to have to crack on. So I can only say thank you very much. That's terrific information. Again, the panel discussion has all been filmed, so you will be able to look back and hear it again if you need to. But in the meanwhile, round of applause for our wonderful vets, please.